Emily Carter pressed her palm flat against her father's chest and felt the last breath leave him in the dark, not peaceful, not quiet, just gone. By morning, the wagon was moving without her. No warning, no goodbye. Just wheel tracks fading into summer dust, and a stepmother who never once looked back. If you've ever been discarded by the people who were supposed to love you, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel, follow Emily's journey all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning her father died, Emily Carter turned 23 years old. Nobody remembered. She had spent the night before crouched beside him inside the canvas-covered wagon, one hand wrapped around his, listening to his breathing. Change first ragged, then slow, then silence so absolute, it felt like the world itself had stopped turning. She pressed 2 fingers to the side of his throat and held them there longer than she needed to, because taking them away meant accepting something she wasn't ready for. His name was Robert Carter. He had been a school teacher in Ohio, a man who read aloud at dinner and laughed too easily at his own jokes, and smelled like pipe tobacco and sawdust. He had also been in the last 4 months of his life a man who had made exactly one catastrophic mistake. He had married Margaret Hale. Emily had watched it happen with the quiet dread of someone watching a wrong door swing open, and knowing the wind would carry everything through it. Margaret was a widow with property in Virginia, and ambitions that didn't fit Virginia anymore. She spoke well. She dressed well. She looked at Robert Carter with an expression Emily could only describe as strategic warmth, calculated enough to function as affection measured enough to keep its distance. Robert, who had spent 3 years grieving Emily's mother and 2 more pretending he wasn't lonely, never stood a chance. The wedding was small. The move west was Margaret's idea. Montana territory, she said. Land. Opportunity. A new life for all of them. Emily had packed her trunk without a word. Now her father was dead in the back of a wagon somewhere in Wyoming, and the summer heat had already turned the canvas into something that trapped air instead of moving it, and outside she could hear Margaret's voice giving directions. Calm. Controlled. As if nothing had changed. Emily stepped out of the wagon. The trail camp was already half-packed. 3 other families on the wagon train moved with practiced morning efficiency, fires smothered bedrolls, tied horses fed and harnessed. Nobody looked at her. She was the girl from the Carter wagon, the quiet one, and they had learned early in the journey that quiet people didn't usually require attention. Margaret stood near the lead horse, with Thomas the wagon master, a thick-necked man from Kentucky who wore his authority the way some men wore belts, tight and functional and visible. "We can cover 16 miles before the heat peaks," Margaret was saying. "If we rest the animals at the creek junction, we make Sweetwater by Thursday." Thomas nodded, checking something in his ledger. Emily walked toward them. "My father died last night." Thomas looked up. His expression shifted into something respectful and uncomfortable at the same time. "I'm real sorry, miss. He was a good man." "He was," Emily said. She looked at Margaret. "We need to stop. We need to bury him properly." Margaret turned. Her expression was composed, not cold exactly, but the kind of composed that had armor underneath it, the kind that had decided something before this conversation began. "We'll bury him here," Margaret said. "We don't have time to stop movement for more than an hour." Emily stared at her. "An hour?" "The ground is soft near the creek bed. It won't take long." "He was your husband." "And he is gone," Margaret said, and her voice didn't waver, didn't crack, didn't offer a single syllable of grief. "Standing here suffering won't change that. Moving forward might." Emily felt something cold settle into her chest. Not grief. She was full of grief, had been full of it all night. This was something different. This was the first clear understanding of a thing she had been trying not to know for 4 months. Margaret Hale had never loved Robert Carter. She had used him. And now he was inconvenient in death the same way he had been inconvenient in illness, too slow, too dependent, too much weight on a machine that was built to move. They buried him in 40 minutes beside a creek with no name. Thomas read a short verse from Psalms. 2 of the other men helped dig. Emily stood at the edge of the grave and could not cry because the tears had gone somewhere deep and locked, and she could not find the key. She put her hand on the mound of turned dirt. "I'll come back," she said quietly. "When I can. I'll come back and put something here with your name on it." She meant it. She had no idea standing there that she would never keep that promise. Not because she didn't try, but because by the end of the day, she would no longer have a way to come back from anywhere. The trouble started 3 hours after burial, when Emily climbed back into the wagon and found her trunk open. Not rifled through. Not disturbed in the way of accident or curiosity. Removed. Her clothes were gone. Her mother's Bible was gone. The small tin box where she kept what remained of her savings, $41 a sum, she had built slowly over 2 years of teaching sewing lessons back in Ohio, was gone. She stared at the empty space for a long moment. Then she climbed out of the wagon and walked to the front where Margaret sat on the driver's bench with her back straight and her eyes on the trail ahead. "Where are my things?" Emily asked. Margaret didn't turn. "What things?" "My trunk, my money, my mother's Bible." "I don't know what you're referring to." The words landed with such practiced neutrality that for one confused second, Emily doubted herself. Then she didn't. "Stop the wagon." Margaret pulled the reins. The horse slowed. "Emily." "Where are my things, Margaret?" Margaret turned then, and what Emily saw on her face was not guilt. It was patience, the deliberate insulting patience of someone explaining a reality to a person they consider beneath argument. "Your father left no will," Margaret said. "Everything in the wagon is mine. The money, the goods, all of it. That's the law." "That money was mine. I earned it. You earned it in your father's household under your father's roof as part of your father's family. Your father is dead. I am the widow. The law is clear." Emily gripped the side of the wagon. "You can't—" "I have," Margaret said. "And I'd suggest you lower your voice because I have 15 witnesses on this trail who saw you climbing through the wagon unsupervised this morning, and I'd hate for anyone to get the wrong impression about your character." The threat was so quiet, so precise, so utterly without rage that Emily stood in the road for a full 5 seconds without speaking. She was 23 years old. She had $41 that were no longer hers. She had a dead father in an unmarked grave and a stepmother who had just made it clear without raising her voice, without a single unkind word that could be repeated back, that Emily Carter was now a liability to be managed. "Get back in the wagon," Margaret said. "Or don't." Emily got back in the wagon. She spent the rest of that day thinking, not grieving, not crying. Thinking carefully, methodically, the way her father had taught her to think through problems when she was small, and the world felt too large and impossible to navigate. "Break it down," he used to say. "What do you know for certain? What are your options? What does each option cost you?" What she knew for certain, Margaret had planned this. The missing trunk, the legal language, the calm precision of the threat, none of it was improvised. Margaret had looked at Robert Carter's declining health and calculated outcomes the way a chess player calculates moves. And somewhere in that calculation, Emily had been assigned a category. Obstacle. Cost. Removal. What were her options? She could stay on the wagon and hope for what Margaret's change of heart. That was not an option. She could appeal to Thomas the wagon master, but Thomas had a contract with Margaret and no particular reason to place his authority on the side of a dead man's daughter with no money and no proof. She could appeal to the other families, but the other families had their own concerns, their own children, their own miles to cover. What did each option cost her? She was still working through that particular calculation when on the evening of the second day after her father's death, the wagon stopped at a creek crossing in a stand of cottonwood trees, and Margaret climbed down and walked around to the back canvas flap and opened it. Emily looked up from where she sat on the wagon bed. "Get out," Margaret said. Just that. 2 words. "What?" "Get out of my wagon. You'll walk the rest of the way." Emily looked at her. "To Montana. You want me to walk to Montana?" "I want you out of my wagon." Margaret set a small bundle on the wagon gate, a piece of bread wrapped in cloth, a tin cup, a single wool blanket. An insult packaged as mercy. There's a trading post 11 miles north. You can find work there. Wash dishes. Sew. You're capable enough. Emily stood up slowly. She was taller than Margaret by 2 inches, and she used those inches now, pulling herself to full height in the wagon bed and looking down at the woman who had systematically removed every support her life had been built on. "You planned this before we left Ohio," Emily said. It was not a question. Margaret's expression didn't change. "Don't be dramatic. You needed my father's name to join the wagon train. You needed his money to fund the journey. And you needed to be rid of me before you arrived anywhere you intended to stay, because I'm the only person who knows who you actually are." Something moved in Margaret's eyes. Brief, almost imperceptible. Not guilt, something more complex than guilt. Acknowledgement. The look of a person who has been correctly understood and finds it neither surprising nor threatening. 11 miles north, Margaret said again. Emily climbed down from the wagon. She took the bundle because she was not stupid, and because the bread and the blanket were not Margaret's mercy, they were her own survival, and she was entitled to her own survival, regardless of who was handing it over. She stood in the cottonwood shadow and watched the wagon train resume its movement. 3 families, their horses, their futures, their irrelevance to her from this moment forward. Margaret did not look back. The last wagon disappeared around a bend in the trail. Emily stood alone on the Wyoming frontier in the middle of summer with a piece of bread, a tin cup, a wool blanket, and nothing else. She ate half the bread. She drank from the creek. She folded the blanket over her arm and started walking. Not north. She had no intention of washing dishes in a trading post while Margaret Hale reinvented herself in Montana on Robert Carter's money, and Robert Carter's name, and Robert Carter's grave. She walked in the direction the wagon train had come from, back toward the unmarked grave beside the unnamed creek, because it was the only fixed point she had, and she needed a fixed point before she could decide anything else. She walked for 6 hours. She did not reach the grave. What she reached instead sometime around midnight, with the stars blazing overhead and the Wyoming dark so complete it had weight to it, was the end of her legs. She had been walking on will alone for the last 2 hours. She knew this because the bread was gone, the water in her tin cup was gone, and the part of her brain that usually monitored pain had gone quiet in the specific way it goes quiet when there's too much pain to report on individually. Her feet had blistered through her boots. Her hands were cut from grabbing at scrub brush when the trail went soft and she lost her footing. Her face and forearms were scorched from the day's sun, and beneath all of it was a grief so massive she couldn't feel the edges of it. Her father was dead, her money was gone. Her name meant nothing out here, and she was alone in the kind of alone that was not a temporary condition, but a new, permanent geography. She sat down beside a pile of boulders, because she could not take another step. She pulled the wool blanket around her shoulders. She looked up at the stars and thought about her father reading Psalm 23 at the kitchen table in Ohio on Sunday mornings, his voice unhurried, a cup of tea going cold beside his elbow. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death," she said aloud to no one, "I will fear no evil." Then she stopped, because she was afraid. She was genuinely deeply afraid in a way that the words of a psalm written 3,000 years ago could not reach. She heard the wolves before she saw them. Not howling, that was the sound wolves made at distance at the moon in stories. This was different. This was a low, guttural communication close enough that she could hear the individual voices in it, and it was the sound of animals who had located prey and were discussing logistics. She stood up. Her legs nearly gave. She grabbed the boulder behind her. 3 shapes materialized from the darkness at the edge of her vision. Low to the ground, patient ears flat. They were not running. Running would have been easier. Running would have been a straightforward terror. What they were doing was worse. They were waiting, letting her understand the situation. Emily grabbed a rock from the ground beside her and threw it, hard. It hit the lead wolf in the shoulder and it flinched and snarled, and the sound of that snarl was the most frightening thing she had ever heard. but it didn't advance. She grabbed another rock. "Get away from me," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Get away." She threw the second rock. Missed. The pack shifted, spreading sideways, trying to get angles on her. She turned to keep them in front of her. Her back found the boulder. She had rocks in both hands and nothing else, and the wolves knew it. Animals were not stupid. Animals were often considerably smarter than the situations humans invented for themselves. The lead wolf crouched, coiled. Emily threw the rock in her right hand and braced for the impact that was coming. The gunshot was so loud that for a full second she thought she had been shot. The lead wolf yelped and bolted. The other two scattered behind it, vanishing into the dark with the liquid speed of things that had been born to disappear. Silence. Then the sound of boots on rocky ground. A man stepped around the boulder from the uphill side, tall, lean, in the way of someone who moved a great deal and ate when he could, rather than when he wanted to, wearing a dark hat and a canvas jacket with the collar turned up, despite the summer heat, carrying a rifle that still had a thread of smoke rising from its barrel. He stopped about 10 feet away from her. He looked at her. She looked at him. He did not say, "You're safe." He did not say, "Don't worry." He did not say any of the things that people said in the stories her father used to read, aloud, the stories where men arrived in the last moment and pronounced the danger over and the world restored. He said, "You're alive. That's enough for now." His voice was low and flat, and completely without drama. It was the voice of a man who had said useful things for so long that he'd stopped distinguishing between useful and comforting. Emily realized her hands were shaking. She looked down at them. One of them still held a rock. She dropped it. "There were 3 of them," she said, because she needed to say something, and that was what came out. "I saw." He glanced at the direction the wolves had gone, then back at her. He was looking at her the way a person looks at a map when they're trying to determine where they are, not unkindly, but without any particular sentiment. Taking stock. "You're hurt." "I'm aware." "Can you walk?" "I've been walking for 6 hours. My ability to continue is in question." Something moved in his face, not quite amusement, more like the shadow of recognition, the look of a person who has heard a particular kind of stubbornness before and knows what it usually indicates. He slung the rifle over his shoulder. "There's a cabin," he said, "half-mile east. You can make it." "Half a mile." "On flat ground. I'll go slow." Emily looked at him. She was not naive. She was a woman alone on the frontier in the middle of the night with no resources and no weapons. And the man in front of her was a stranger she knew nothing about, except that he had arrived with a rifle and an economy of language and no apparent interest in explaining himself. She also had no other options, and she was smart enough to know the difference between the danger in front of her and the danger behind her. "What's your name?" she said. "Maddox. Cole Maddox." "Emily Carter." She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and stepped away from the boulder. Her legs held. Barely, but they held. "Half a mile." "Half a mile," he confirmed, and started walking east. She followed. The cabin was exactly half a mile east, which she counted, because counting steps gave her something to do other than concentrate on the pain in her feet. It was a single-room structure built into the side of a low hill with a sod roof and a stone chimney, and a door that hung from leather hinges and opened outward. Inside, a stone fireplace, a workbench along one wall, a narrow rope bed in the corner shelves, with provisions, 2 lanterns, and the organized spareness of a person who had decided exactly what they needed and removed everything else. Cole Maddox built the fire without being asked. He put a pot of water on and indicated a stool near the hearth. Emily sat on it. The warmth hit her like a physical force, and she felt her shoulders drop from somewhere near her ears back toward their normal position. He set a tin cup in front of her. Coffee. Strong enough to be its own substance. She drank it. He sat across from her on an upturned crate and looked at her boots. "Take those off." "I'm fine. The skin has worn through the leather from the inside. You've been bleeding for a while." Take them off or they'll be worse in the morning. She took off her boots. She didn't look at her feet. She looked at the fire. Where were you headed? He asked. I'm not sure anymore. Where did you come from? A wagon train, going north. She wrapped both hands around the tin cup. My father died 2 days ago. His widow, my stepmother, removed my belongings and left me on the trail. Cole Maddox looked at her for a long moment. She had the sense he was not surprised, not because he had expected this particular story, but because he had lived long enough in wild country to understand that the things that drove people onto frontier trails at midnight were rarely small. You have family anywhere, he said. No. Money. No. Plan. She looked at him directly. He had dark eyes and a jaw that looked like it had been set against something for a long time. He was not handsome in the way that word usually got used. He was something more functional than that, built for endurance rather than impression. I don't have a plan, she said. I have a direction. I intend to find where Margaret Hale ends up, and I intend to make sure that what she did has consequences. I don't know how yet. That's honest. He nodded slowly. Not approving, not disapproving, absorbing. You can stay here tonight, he said. I'll take the floor. Tomorrow, we'll figure out what's next. Emily set down the cup. Why? He looked at her. Why are you offering that? She said. You don't know me. This is your home. I'm a stranger who was about to be eaten by wolves. Cole Maddox was quiet for a moment. Outside, the summer wind moved through the grass above the sod roof with a sound like breathing. I found a man on this same trail 6 years ago, he said finally. Broken leg, fever. Pack had gone ahead without him. I rode past him. He paused. I've thought about that every single day since. I'm not doing it again. It was the most words he had strung together since she'd met him. It didn't sound like a speech. It sounded like a fact he had decided to share because the occasion required it. Emily nodded. All right, she said. She did not say thank you. Something told her he would not want that. He had not done this for gratitude. He had done it because he had a debt to pay to a man he'd never gone back for, and she happened to be standing in the location where the payment was due. She understood that. It was a transaction she could respect. She slept on the rope bed. He slept on the floor with his saddle for a pillow. When she woke in the gray early hours, with her heart hammering from a dream she couldn't name, she could hear his slow, deliberate breathing on the other side of the room, and it was the most ordinary sound she'd heard in days. And she lay still in the dark and let it settle her. By the time the light came through the cracks in the door, she had made a decision. She was not walking to a trading post to wash dishes. She was not walking away from Margaret Hale. And she was not walking away from whatever this place was, this half-mile east cabin, built into a hillside by a man who had been carrying a 6-year-old act of cowardice like a stone in his chest, until she had something stronger than grief to carry instead. Cole Maddox had not spoken to another person in 4 months before Emily Carter appeared out of the Wyoming dark with rocks in her hands and blisters through her boots. He was not a man who would have described this as loneliness. He would have described it as preference. There was a difference, and he held to that difference with the same precision he held to everything: the way he stacked firewood, the way he kept his rifle, the way he organized his provisions and his thoughts and his mornings. Precision was what had kept him functional out here. Sentiment was what had driven him out here in the first place. He had come to the Wyoming territory 5 years ago from Billings, which he had come to from somewhere before Billings that he had stopped naming. He was 33 years old, and he had been 3 things in his life: a soldier, a failure, and a mountain man in that order, and only the third had held. He went through his morning routine without altering it. Water, fire, rifle check, horse, and left the woman sleeping because she needed it, and because the alternative was waking her to an awkwardness he didn't have language for. When she came out of the cabin an hour later, her hair pulled back and her boots on. Despite what they'd done to her feet, he was at the woodpile. You don't have to, she said, looking at the axe in his hand. I know, he said, and split another log. She stood for a moment, adjusting to the morning, taking in the landscape. The cabin sat on a bench above a narrow valley with a creek running through it, and stands of pine on the upper slopes, and the mountains visible to the west, their peaks still carrying the last of the winter snow, even in July. It was, he knew, objectively beautiful country. He had stopped seeing it the way strangers saw it. He saw it now mostly as terrain. She surprised him. "Those mountains," she said. "Which ones?" "Wind Rivers." "How far?" "3 days riding, less if you push." She nodded. Then, "Do you have paper? Something to write on?" He did. He went inside and got the small journal he kept provisions lists in, and tore out a blank page and gave it to her with a pencil. She sat on the chopping block and wrote for 10 minutes without speaking. He kept working. When she was done, she folded the paper carefully. "I'm writing down what Margaret Hale did," she said. "Every detail I can remember. Dates, locations, witnesses. What was taken, what was said, what was implied." She looked up. "If I'm going to do anything about it, I need a record. Something that exists outside of my own head." Cole set the axe down. "What do you think you can do about it?" "I don't know yet," she said with the same honest directness she'd used the night before. "But Margaret made one mistake. She underestimated how far I'm willing to go." He looked at her for a moment. She was not what he had expected in the hours he'd had to form expectations. The women who ended up on the frontier were usually one of two types: those who had chosen it with their whole will, and those who had been deposited in it against their will, and they behaved very differently under pressure. Emily Carter had been deposited, but she was behaving like a woman who had chosen. He respected that. He respected most things that made sense under pressure. "You can stay here," he said, "until you have a plan." She looked at him steadily. "I'll earn my keep." "I'm not asking you to." "I know. I'm telling you." She stood up and tucked the folded paper inside her dress. "What needs doing today?" He looked at her. Then he picked up the axe and handed it to her. "There's about 2 more hours of wood in that pile," he said, "and a snare line east of the creek that needs checking, and the horse's right front shoe is loose, and I need someone to hold his head while I fix it." She took the axe. She looked at the woodpile. She looked back at him. "Show me the snare line first," she said. "I've never set snares." "You'll need to know," he said. "Yes," she said. "I will." He did not smile. He was not a man who smiled easily, and this was not a situation that called for it. But something settled in the set of his jaw, something that had been held tight for a long time, easing fractionally the way a rope eases when you find the right tension point. He turned east and walked toward the creek. She followed. For the first time since her father's last breath, Emily Carter was not running from something. She was learning something. And in the Wyoming summer, with the Wind Rivers cutting the western sky, and the creek cold and clear, and a mountain cowboy walking ahead of her, who owed a debt to a man he'd never helped, that was enough. That was for now enough. The snare line was 3/4 of a mile east of the creek, and Cole Maddox walked it the way he did everything, without wasting motion, without explaining himself, unless explanation was required. Emily followed 2 steps behind and watched how he moved through terrain where he put his feet. How he read the ground the way other people read faces. The first snare was empty. He reset it without comment. The second had a rabbit already gone. He removed it efficiently and handed it to Emily without looking at her. She took it without flinching, which he noticed. The third snare had been sprung by something bigger than a rabbit, the wire was bent, and the stake had been pulled half out of the ground. Cole crouched and looked at the tracks around it. "Coyote," he said. "Can you reset it?" "Not here. Something that size finds a snare once it remembers the location." He pulled the stake and coiled the wire. "We'll move it." "How do you know where to put it?" He stood and looked at her. She was asking because she wanted to know, not because she was filling silence. He had learned the difference between those two things early and valued it. "Water and travel paths," he said. "Animals move the same way people do. They take the easiest route between what they need. You find the routes, you find them." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the ground around the sprung snare. Then she crouched where he had crouched and looked at it from the same angle. "There," she said, pointing to a narrow gap between two boulders about 30 yards north. They'd go through there to reach the creek. He looked. She was right. He didn't say that. He picked up his equipment and walked toward the gap, and she followed, and they reset the snare together in a silence that was, for the first time since she'd arrived, something other than uncomfortable. On the walk back to the cabin, she said, "You've been out here alone a long time." "Long enough. By choice." He looked at her sideways. Most people, when they asked that question, were really asking something else. They were asking why they were asking what happened. They were asking for a story that explained a man who chose solitude over civilization. He had given that story to exactly no one, and had no intention of changing that policy. But she didn't ask why. She just asked the one question, and then let it sit there without pulling at it. "By choice," he said. "All right," she said. That was the end of it. He was not accustomed to things ending where they were supposed to end. He found it quietly, and without acknowledgement, something close to relief. They ate the rabbit at midday with dried beans from Cole's stores and the last of the coffee. Emily ate like someone who had not eaten properly in days, which she hadn't, and she did not apologize for it, which he respected. She ate what she needed and stopped when she was done, and then sat with her tin cup and looked at her folded paper on the workbench. "Tell me about the towns north of here," she said. Cole leaned back on his crate. "What do you want to know?" The wagon train was heading to Montana territory. There are settlements on the route, trading posts, mining camps, supply towns. If Margaret Hale was planning to establish herself somewhere, she would have needed a specific destination before she left Ohio. She's not a woman who acts without a destination. Emily picked up the paper and looked at it. There was a name she used. A few times when she thought I wasn't listening. Alder Gulch. Cole was quiet for a moment. "That's in Madison Valley, south of Virginia City." "You know it." "I know of it. Gold camp originally. Some of it's turned into proper settlement. Land values are high because of the mining expansion. People with money to invest have been moving in, buying claims, buying property, buying influence." Emily looked at him. "That's where she's going." "Sounds like it." "Then that's where I'm going, eventually." Cole looked at her across the small table. She said it the way a person states a direction on a map, not with drama, not with heat, just with the flat certainty of someone who has worked through the variables and arrived at a conclusion. "That's a long way from here," he said. "I know." She refolded the paper. "I also know I can't walk into Alder Gulch with nothing and expect to accomplish anything. Margaret has money. She has social position. She'll have established herself by the time I arrive, which means I need time and I need preparation." She looked at him. "Which is why I'm asking about the towns north of here instead of asking you to saddle a horse." Cole looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You reckon she knows you survived?" It wasn't a question. But Emily answered it. "She left me with bread and a blanket," she said. "She didn't leave me with nothing because nothing is conspicuous. A small mercy is forgettable." Her jaw tightened, a small movement controlled. "She doesn't know whether I survived, but she calculated the odds and decided they were acceptable. And if she finds out..." Emily's eyes were very steady. "Then I want to be somewhere she can't reach me while I get ready." Cole turned his tin cup in his hands. Outside the cabin, his horse shifted in the lean-to, and the afternoon wind came off the mountains and moved through the grass above them, and the summer light was long and golden and entirely indifferent to the conversation happening below it. "There's a supply run I make every 6 weeks," he said. "Town called Burnt Creek, 20 miles south. I know a woman there runs a boarding house, decent, private. She doesn't talk about her guests." Emily waited. "I go next week," he said. "You can come. If you want to send a letter to anyone, or find out if there's any law office that handles estate disputes." Emily set her cup down. Something moved in her expression, not gratitude exactly, more like recognition. The look of a person who has been offered something they needed and wasn't sure they had the right to ask for. "Is there," she said, "law that handles estate disputes out here?" "Sometimes. Territorial law is inconsistent. Depends on the circuit judge and whether someone can make a case. He looked at her. You'd need documentation, witnesses. It's not straightforward. Nothing worth doing is, she said. He almost said something then. He could feel the word forming something simple and affirming the kind of thing one person says to another when a moment asks for it. He let it pass. He was not built for those moments, and she didn't seem to need one. Instead, he stood and picked up the rabbit bones and put them in the fire and said, "Horse's shoe, I still need help with that." Emily stood. Lead the way. Did. The days that followed established themselves into a pattern before either of them named it. Cole woke first always before dawn and had the fire going and water on by the time Emily emerged from sleep. She woke fast, not gradually, not slowly into consciousness, but quickly and completely, the way people woke who had been trained by circumstance to be alert. He recognized it because he woke the same way. She ate what was provided without comment. She worked without being asked twice. She made mistakes, reset a snare in the wrong location, and lost a catch oversalted. The one meal she cooked misjudged a rope knot and had to redo it 3 times, and she corrected them without dramatics and without requiring reassurance. On the 4th day, he handed her his spare rifle. She looked at it. "I've never fired a rifle," she said. "I know. You're going to teach me. I'm going to show you how it works. Whether you learn is up to you." She accepted the rifle. She was a poor shot for the first hour, pulling wide left consistently, which meant she was anticipating the recoil and correcting preemptively instead of letting the shot happen. He told her this once. On the 2nd hour, she adjusted. By the 3rd hour, she was hitting her mark 2 shots in 3. She didn't celebrate this. She just reloaded and fired again. That evening, sitting by the fire with the summer dark settled thick and close outside, she said, "Why did you leave Billings?" He looked at her. She was looking at the fire, not at him, giving him the option of the question without the pressure of her eyes on it. He had not spoken about Billings to anyone in 5 years. The fact of Billings sat inside him like a stone that had been there so long it had become part of the landscape, something he'd stopped noticing specifically because it was always there. "There was a woman," he said. Emily didn't move. "Her name was Clara. We were engaged. I came back from the war, not right, not the way you come back from a thing and set it down and go on. The way you come back and find out you don't know how to be in a house anymore, how to eat at a table, how to stop listening for sounds that aren't there." He paused. "I tried for 2 years. I wasn't good at it. She found someone who was better at it." "Did she leave or did you—" "Both," he said. "She left first. I made sure she did." Emily was quiet for the long moment. The fire snapped. "That's the most honest thing I've heard anyone say about a marriage that didn't happen," she said. He looked at her then, and she looked back, and it was the first time they had held eye contact for more than a few seconds. There was nothing romantic in it, or rather there was nothing only romantic in it. There was also the specific recognition of 2 people who had both been broken by something and were both still standing, and who had just acknowledged that fact to each other without dressing it up. He looked away first. "Get some sleep," he said. "The snare line needs running early tomorrow if we want anything for breakfast." Emily stood. "Cole." He looked up. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me that." He nodded once and turned back to the fire. She went to bed. He sat with the fire until it went to coals, and for the first time in a long time, the silence of the cabin felt different, not emptier than it should, but exactly as full as it was, and that being enough. On the 6th day, a rider came. Cole heard the horse before he saw it. He always heard things before he saw them, which was one of the reasons he was still alive. He was at the woodpile when the sound reached him, and he straightened and turned, and his hand went to his rifle before he'd consciously decided to move it. Emily was at the creek washing. She heard the horse too, he could tell by the way she went still. The rider came over the low rise to the south and pulled up about 100 yards out. He was young, 20, maybe 22, wearing a battered hat and a mail carrier's satchel across his chest. He raised one hand in the flat palm greeting of someone who wanted to make very clear he was not a threat. Cole lowered the rifle, but didn't put it away. "Cole Maddox," the writer called. "That's right. Got a message for you. From a man called Hargrove in Burnt Creek. Said it was urgent." Cole walked to meet him. He took the folded paper the writer produced from the satchel. He read it standing in the morning sun. Emily had come up from the creek. She stood a few feet away, her sleeves still wet, watching his face. His face did not do much, but she was learning to read the things his face didn't do, and what it wasn't doing now was staying relaxed. He folded the paper and put it in his pocket and handed the writer 2 coins from his belt and said, "Thank you." The writer touched his hat and turned his horse south. Cole walked back toward the cabin. "What is it?" Emily said, falling into step beside him. He didn't answer immediately. He went inside, put the paper on the workbench, and poured 2 cups of water from the pitcher. He set one in front of her. "Hargrove is a merchant in Burnt Creek," he said. "I buy my provisions from him. He also hears things wagon trains passing through Traveler's News from the north." He sat down. "A woman arrived in Burnt Creek 4 days ago, traveling alone coming from the South Trail. She was asking questions." Emily's hands went still around her cup. "What kind of questions?" "About a young woman," Cole said. "Dark-haired, traveling on foot. Whether anyone had seen her. Whether anyone had brought her in." The silence in the cabin lasted for exactly 3 seconds. "She knows I survived," Emily said. "It appears so." "How?" Cole looked at her steadily. "Someone on the wagon train, probably. A child who saw something. A woman who noticed you weren't on the wagon the next morning. Word travels on the trail. People talk at watering stops at campsites. It only takes one person saying something to the wrong ear." Emily stood up. She walked to the window, not looking out of it, just moving because she needed to move, or the thing forming in her chest would find no exit. "She didn't just miscalculate the odds," Emily said. "She was watching. She checked." She turned. "That means she was worried." "That means she was thorough," Cole said. "Don't confuse the two." "What's the difference?" "Worry means she's afraid of you. Thorough means she's doing what she always does, eliminating variables." He looked at her levelly. "Right now, you're an unresolved variable. That's different from being a threat." Emily heard that. She sat back down. She picked up her cup. "The woman in Burnt Creek," she said. "Was it Margaret herself?" "Hargrove didn't say. He said she was well-dressed, well-spoken, hired one of the town's men to ask around quietly, not Margaret personally, someone on her behalf." Emily went very still. "She sent someone," she said slowly. "She didn't come herself. That means she's already where she's going. She's already in Alder Gulch, and she sent someone back to check." Cole waited. "Which means she's established enough to have people she can send." Emily's voice was quiet and precise, and completely without hysteria. "Which means she moved fast, and she moved smart, and she is exactly what I thought she was." "What's that?" "Dangerous." Emily looked at him. "I'm not ready." "No," he agreed. "How long do I need to be here before I am?" He looked at her for a long moment. He looked at her hands, the blisters healing, the calluses forming. He looked at how she was sitting straighter than she'd sat 6 days ago, more deliberate. He thought about the snare line and the rifle and the way she'd corrected her shot without being told twice. "That depends," he said, "on what ready means to you." She thought about it. "I need to be able to defend myself. I need to know this country well enough to move through it without help. I need enough of a record written, documented, that if I walk into a law office, someone will take me seriously." She paused. "And I need to know something about Alder Gulch. What it is now, who controls it, what Margaret has built there, and where the weak points are." Cole was quiet for a moment. "That's 3 months," he said. "Maybe 4. She nodded. "Then that's how long I'll stay." He looked at her across the table. She looked back at him, and it was that same held eye contact as the night before, the same flat recognition, the same absence of pretense. "This is still my cabin," he said. "My rules." "I know. And my rules include not doing anything reckless because you're angry." Emily met his gaze without blinking. "My father would have said the same thing, in almost the same words. He didn't know what to do with that." He picked up his cup. "I'll write back to Hargrove," he said. "Tell him to say nothing to anyone about this location. And if that woman, or anyone like her, comes asking again to send word." Emily nodded. "And the supply run," he added. "We go earlier than I planned. There's a man in Burnt Creek, Abel Marsh. He's not a lawyer, but he knows the law. He's written petitions for people before documented claims handled disputes. If you're going to build a case, he's where you start." Emily straightened slightly. "You know him well." "Well enough. He owes me a debt." Cole said it without elaboration, and she didn't ask for any. She stood and picked up the water cups and took them to the wash basin. She was quiet for a moment, her back to him, and then she said, "She thought leaving me with a blanket and a piece of bread was enough mercy to keep her conscience clean. She thought the frontier would finish what she started." "It almost did." "Almost," Emily said. "That's the word that matters." She turned around. Something had settled in her face, not hardened exactly, more like resolved. The grief was still there. He could see it. It would be there for a long time, the grief for her father, but it had found a place to sit inside her, instead of moving through her like weather. "When do we leave for Burnt Creek?" she said. "Day after tomorrow," Cole said. "Gives us time to prepare, and gives Hargrove time to arrange a meeting with Marsh." "All right." She went to the workbench and picked up the folded paper, the one she'd been adding to each evening, her careful documentation of everything Margaret had done and said and taken. She unfolded it and picked up the pencil. "Then I'll spend tomorrow adding everything I remember about Margaret's conversation with the wagon train organizer back in St. Louis, the agreement she made, the terms, who witnessed them." Cole watched her sit down at the workbench and begin to write, her penmanship careful and deliberate, the pencil moving steadily. He picked up his rifle and went outside. The morning was already warm, full summer now, the Wyoming heat building toward its midday weight. The mountains to the west were clear and sharp. His horse was in the lean-to, watching him with the mild interest horses gave to human activity. He stood for a moment with the rifle in the crook of his arm and looked at the horizon south in the direction of Burnt Creek, and beyond it the long trail north to Alder Gulch and whatever Margaret Hale was building there. He had not left this valley for anything except provisions in 2 years. He had not involved himself in another person's trouble in longer than that. He had come here specifically to stop being involved in things that cost him, and he had succeeded, and he had told himself the cost of that success was acceptable. He thought about Abel Marsh and what it would take to get him to write a territorial petition. He thought about the circuit court schedule and which judge handled Madison County claims. He thought about things he had not thought about in a long time, and they came back to him with a clarity that surprised him, not because he had forgotten them, but because he had been determined not to use them. He was involved now. He knew it. He had known it if he was honest from the moment he handed Emily Carter his spare rifle and watched her adjust her grip and stop pulling wide. He had not saved her from the wolves just to leave her to whatever Margaret Hale was sending south on her behalf. He turned and went back inside. Emily was still writing, her head bent over the paper, her hand moving steadily. She had covered both sides of the original page and moved on to a second piece he'd left on the workbench. The documentation was growing. It was becoming something with weight and shape, something that could be placed in front of a man like Abel Marsh and taken seriously. Cole sat down on his crate and picked up a piece of leather he'd been working on, harness repair practical, something that needed doing. He worked in silence. After a while, Emily said without looking up, "You came back inside." "Supply list," he said. "Need to know what we're short on before we go to Burnt Creek." "Right." She kept writing. He kept working on the harness. The fire burned low but not out. The morning moved around them. Neither of them said what was actually true. which was that something had shifted in the architecture of the cabin, the way two separate weights on a scale shift when a third weight is added, finding a new center that neither of them had balanced around before. They didn't say it because it didn't need saying. The frontier was not a place for things that didn't need saying. It was a place for what was true and necessary and what you were willing to act on, and both of them, in their separate silences, were working on exactly that. They left for Burnt Creek the following morning before sunrise. Cole saddled his horse, a broad-chested gray he called nothing in particular, but treated with the specific consideration a man gives to something he depends on completely, and brought out a second horse from the lean-to. A bay mare, older, steady. He'd traded for her 2 winters ago from a Shoshone family, and kept her for the seasons when the terrain required 2 animals. Emily looked at the mare, and then at Cole. "You have 2 horses," she said. "Apparently. You live alone." "I did." She looked at him. He was checking the cinch on his saddle, with his back to her. She could not see his expression, and she understood that this was intentional, and she let it be. She mounted the bay without assistance, and adjusted the stirrups, and settled herself in the saddle with the focused competence of someone who had ridden before, not recently, but not never. "You can ride," he said, turning. "My father taught me. Ohio farm before the school teaching." She gathered the reins. "I'm not as good as I was." "You'll be better again by the time we reach Burnt Creek." He swung up onto the gray and turned south, and she pulled the bay alongside him, and they rode out of the valley as the sky went from black to dark blue to the first pale gray of early morning, and the mountains behind them held their snow against the summer dark. They rode for an hour without speaking. She didn't fill the silence, and he didn't need to. The trail was rough in places and required attention, and she gave it attention, reading the ground, adjusting her balance, giving the mare her head on the rocky sections. He watched this without appearing to watch it, which was a skill he'd developed out of necessity and applied without thinking. When the trail flattened and widened enough for conversation, she said, "Tell me about Abel Marsh." Cole considered. "He came west from Pennsylvania about 8 years ago. Started as a claims recorder, someone who documents mining claims, officially witnesses the legal language. He has more knowledge of territorial law than most people who don't have a law degree, which out here is sometimes more useful than having one, because the law out here moves faster than trained lawyers do. Is he trustworthy? He's honest. That's different from trustworthy." Cole kept his eyes on the trail. "He'll do what's legal and what's documented. He won't shade the truth for you. He won't exaggerate your case. But he won't dismiss it because it's inconvenient either." "What does he owe you?" A pause. The horse's hooves on hard ground. A hawk somewhere overhead, its cry carrying wide and flat across the morning. His daughter was sick 2 winters ago. Fever. The town doctor was 3 days south and the weather was closed. I knew a Shoshone woman who knew plant medicines. Cole's voice was even and factual. "I brought the medicine. His daughter lived." Emily was quiet for a moment. "You didn't have to do that." "She was sick," he said. That was sufficient reason. She didn't say anything else. She let it sit the same way she'd let the question about his choosing solitude sit, placing it carefully and then leaving it undisturbed. He was coming to understand that this was her particular skill, not pressing on the things she found, and it was a rarer skill than most people gave it credit for. They reached the outer edge of Burnt Creek by mid-afternoon. Emily felt the town before she fully saw it, the way the air changed, carrying the smell of livestock and wood smoke and the particular density of gathered human activity. She had grown up in a small Ohio town and had missed the feeling of it without knowing she was missing it until it returned. But the feeling also carried a new layer it hadn't before. Every unfamiliar face was a calculation. Every person who might have heard a well-dressed, well-spoken woman asking quiet questions about a dark-haired girl. She sat up straighter in the saddle and kept her expression neutral. Cole had noticed. She knew he'd noticed because he moved his gray slightly ahead of her bay, not blocking her, not hovering, but positioning himself between her and the main street's line of sight, in the way a person does when they are trying to give another person a half-second more to compose themselves. The small gesture landed in her chest with more weight than she expected. They tied the horses at a post outside a dry goods store, and Cole led her down a side street to a narrow building with a sign above the door that read simply, Marsh Records and Correspondence. He knocked twice. The door opened. Abel Marsh was 60, compact, with the bright, careful eyes of a man who had spent decades reading fine print. He looked at Cole with the expression of someone who owed a debt and was at peace with it. Then he looked at Emily. "This the young woman," he said. "This is Emily Carter," Cole said. "She has documentation of a property and estate dispute, and she needs to know what her options are." Marsh stepped back. "Come in then," he said. "Both of you. I'll put the kettle on." Emily stepped inside. The room was exactly what she'd expected from a man who dealt in documents, shelves of ledgers and files, a large desk, 2 chairs across from it, the smell of ink and old paper that she associated specifically and painfully with her father's schoolroom. She sat in one of the chairs and produced the folded pages from inside her dress. Marsh sat across from her and put on wire-rimmed glasses and read in silence while the kettle heated on the small stove in the corner. He read slowly. He went back and reread certain sections. Cole stood near the door. Not hovering, just present. Marsh finished reading. He set the pages on the desk and folded his hands and looked at Emily over his glasses. "Your stepmother claimed everything under spousal inheritance law," he said. "Yes, and she excluded you from the wagon train property inventory." "She did." "Do you have witnesses to any of the specific incidents documented here, particularly the removal of your belongings and the verbal terms of your separation from the party?" Emily met his eyes. "The wagon master Thomas, 2 men who helped dig my father's grave, a woman named Eliza Forrest who traveled with her family and saw me climb out of the wagon the morning I was left." Marsh tapped the pages. "This Eliza Forrest, do you know where she was headed?" "The same wagon train was bound for Helena. She would have arrived by now or close to it." Marsh removed his glasses and set them carefully on the desk. "I want to be honest with you, Miss Carter," he said. And she heard in those words the specific weight of a person who was about to say something accurate and unhelpful. "Territorial spousal inheritance law is not in your favor on its own. A widow inheriting the estate of her husband is legally sound. What might change that picture is evidence of prior agreement, a separate property arrangement, a verbal contract witnessed by others, or evidence of fraudulent intent preceding the marriage." "She married him to use him," Emily said. "She knew he was ill before the wedding. She had planned to make this journey on his name and his money and had arranged to be rid of me before she arrived." "Can you prove the prior knowledge of illness?" "His doctor in Ohio knew. He would have records." "Can you reach that doctor?" "By letter, yes." Marsh picked up his pen. "Then here is what I can do for you today," he said. "I can write a formal record of your statement witnessed and dated. I can write a letter on your behalf to the Circuit Court Registrar requesting information on any property or legal filings made in the name of Margaret Hale or Margaret Carter in Madison County, and I can write to your father's doctor in Ohio requesting medical records relevant to the timeline." He looked at her steadily. "This will take time. Months, likely. The court moves slowly. The territory is large." "I know," Emily said. "I'm not in a hurry to be ready before I am." Something crossed Marsh's face, something that might have been respect, or the shadow of it. He picked up his pen and pulled a fresh sheet toward him. "Then let's begin," he said. Emily straightened in her chair. Cole, standing near the door, was looking at the middle distance with his hat in his hands and the still careful expression he wore when he was paying close attention to something and preferred that no one know it. She didn't look at him, but she was aware of him the way she had become aware of the mountains to the west of the cabin, constantly peripherally, as something that defined the edges of the space she was moving through. Abel Marsh began to write. The kettle came to a boil, and in a small records office in Burnt Creek, Wyoming, on a summer afternoon that smelled like ink and possibility. Emily Carter began to build the thing that Margaret Hale had decided she could never build. A case. A record. A name that could not be erased. Abel Marsh sent the first letter north 3 days after their visit to Burnt Creek. Emily knew this because he wrote to Cole's address, a courtesy they had arranged, since Emily had no fixed address of her own, and Cole handed her the confirmation note without comment when it arrived 2 weeks later. She read it at the workbench while he worked on the harness outside, and then she folded it carefully and added it to the growing stack of papers she kept in a oilskin pouch she'd bought in Burnt Creek with the 2 coins Cole had pressed into her hand without explanation before they left Marsh's office. She had not argued about the coins. She had said nothing. But that evening, she had properly cooked, not just heated whatever was available using the flour and dried fruit she'd also purchased. And she'd set a plate in front of Cole without a word, and he'd eaten it without a word, and that had been the end of the transaction between them, squared and settled. That was how things worked in the cabin. Nothing was given without value returned. Neither of them would have it any other way. The summer deepened. July moved into August with the particular intensity of high country heat, dry and immediate, broken in the late afternoons by thunderstorms that came off the mountains fast, and left just as fast the air afterward smelling of pine and wet rock and something electric that Emily had never smelled in Ohio, and now associated with the specific feeling of being awake in a way she hadn't been before. She ran the snare line alone now. Cole had walked it with her 4 times and then stopped walking it with her, and she understood without being told that this was not abandonment, but assessment. He was watching what she did when he wasn't watching. She checked the snares. She reset them. She noted where the game was moving as the heat changed the water sources, and she adjusted the line accordingly. She was not yet as good at reading the land as Cole was, but she was better than she had been, and the distance between those 2 points was closing. She fired the rifle every morning, not at targets at specific objects she chose at varying distances under varying conditions. Wind from the west, light from different angles, standing crouching one knee on the ground. She kept a rough log of her accuracy the way Cole kept a provisions list, practical without sentiment. He saw the log once. He didn't say anything. But the next day, he moved one of her targets without telling her, placing it at a distance she hadn't tried yet. And she found it and shot at it for an hour before she hit it consistently. She understood this as the closest thing to a compliment his language contained. The letters began arriving in September. The first was from Abel Marsh, a response from the circuit court registrar confirming that a Margaret Hale, formerly Carter, had filed a land purchase in Madison County, Montana Territory, dated 6 weeks after Robert Carter's death. A parcel of 12 acres in the Alder Gulch district, purchased for a sum that represented almost exactly what Robert Carter had carried in liquid assets at the time of his death. Emily read this letter standing at the workbench. She read it twice. Then she set it down and went outside and stood in the yard and breathed carefully for a moment, the way she had learned to breathe when the information coming at her was larger than the container she had ready for it. Cole came around the side of the cabin from the lean-to carrying a saddle blanket. He looked at her face and stopped. "Letter," she said. "Good or bad?" "Both. Margaret bought land in Alder Gulch with my father's money, 6 weeks after he was buried." She turned. She had already arranged the purchase before she left Ohio. She had the parcel identified, she had the seller contacted, she had the funds structured. She was executing a plan she had made before my father was dead. Cole was still. "That's premeditation," Emily said. "Not just opportunism. She planned his death as a financial event. She arranged her inheritance before there was an inheritance." "Can you prove that?" "Not yet, but Marsh can file a request for the seller's records. If the initial contact predates the wedding." She stopped, breathed again. "If the first letter to that seller was written before Margaret married my father, then she married him knowing she intended to take everything he had and leave the rest behind." Cole set the saddle blanket down on the fence post. He looked at her steadily. "That's a different kind of case than an estate dispute." "I know what it is," Emily said. He waited. "It's fraud," she said. "It may be more than fraud." She met his eyes. She didn't cause my father's death. He was sick before she arrived. But she married him for his assets knowing he was dying, and structured the entire journey to ensure she received those assets without contest. Emily's voice was very quiet and very level. And then she left me on a trail to die so there would be no witness. The word landed between them with weight. Cole picked up the saddle blanket. "Write to Marsh tonight," he said. "Tell him to file for the seller's records. Tell him to request the original correspondence." "I will." He started walking back toward the lean-to. Then he stopped. "Emily." She looked at him. "When this is done," he said, "I want you to know that I think your father would consider you worth coming back to." She went very still. He walked into the lean-to without looking back. She stood in the yard for a long moment. The mountains were lit gold in the afternoon light, and the wind was coming down from the high country, carrying the first edges of autumn in it, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk was working the thermals above the valley. She went inside and wrote to Abel Marsh. The second letter arrived 3 weeks later, and it came from a direction Emily hadn't anticipated. It was from Eliza Forrest. Somehow, through the particular telegraph of frontier communities, through the network of names and messages that moved along the wagon trails, like water-finding channels, Eliza Forrest had heard that someone was asking questions about the Carter wagon party. And Eliza Forrest, who had seen Emily climb out of that wagon the morning after she'd been put out, and who had watched the wagon train leave without her and said nothing. Because she hadn't known what to say, had decided that saying nothing had cost her something she wanted back. The letter was 3 pages handwritten in a careful school teacher's hand. It stated dates. It stated what Eliza had observed. It stated that she had heard Margaret Hale tell the wagon master the morning after Robert Carter died that Emily had chosen to leave the party of her own accord and was returning south to family in Kansas. It stated that Eliza had known this to be false and had said nothing. At the bottom of the 3rd page, Eliza Forrest had written, "I am prepared to make this statement before any court that requires it. I am sorry I did not speak sooner. I did not think anyone would believe me over a widow. I should have tried." Emily read this letter sitting on the rope bed, and this time she did not go outside to breathe. This time she sat with it with the weight of what Eliza Forrest had seen and held, and finally released, and she let the grief and the anger and the complicated gratitude move through her in whatever order they chose. Then she got up and went to the workbench and added Eliza Forrest's name and address to her documentation with the particular precision of someone adding a stone to a foundation. When Cole came in that evening, she handed him the letter without speaking. He read it. He handed it back. "Now you have a witness," he said. "Now I have a witness." She agreed. He looked at her for a moment. "You're not celebrating." "No." "Why not?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because Eliza watched me get left behind and said nothing for months. And I understand why she was afraid she had her family to think about. Margaret was convincing and confident, and I had nothing. I understand all of it. But understanding it doesn't make it not true." She folded the letter carefully. "And because Margaret is in Alder Gulch right now building something, and I'm here, and we're still months away from anything I can actually do." Cole sat down. He was quiet for a moment. "There's something you don't know yet," he said. The shift in his voice was small, barely perceptible, but she had spent 3 months learning to read the things he didn't do with his voice, and what it wasn't doing now was staying completely neutral. She looked at him. "I had a letter from Hargrove last week," he said. "I didn't show it to you because I was thinking through what it meant." "Tell me now." He met her eyes. "Margaret Hale is no longer just a landowner in Alder Gulch." The air in the cabin went very still. "In the 6 months since she arrived," Cole said, "she has purchased 3 additional parcels of land, extended credit to 4 local businesses, and according to Hargrove, who hears things from the trading routes north, she is now engaged to a man named Gerald Webb. Webb is the territorial land agent for Madison County." Emily heard every word. She processed them in order. She did not speak until she had processed all of them. "She's marrying the land agent," she said. "Engaged, not yet married." Cole. Her voice was careful and precise in the way it got when she was holding something large inside a small container. The territorial land agent controls the filing and recording of land claims in Madison County. He controls the legal record of property ownership. Yes, if Margaret marries him before our petition reaches the registrar, then she will have access to someone who can delay misfile or quietly bury any documentation that inconveniences her. Emily stood up. She walked to the window. Then she turned back. How long have we got? Hargrove didn't know a date. But engagements on the frontier don't run long. 6 weeks. 8. She pressed her hand flat on the workbench. I'm not ready. I know. I need more time. I know that too. She looked at him. The thing that moved through her face was not panic. It had started as panic, and she had caught it before it arrived and turned it into something she could use. Cole watched this happen. He watched her catch it and turn it. Then I need to change what ready means, she said. I can't wait for perfect. I need enough. He said nothing. He was looking at her with the focused attention of a man who has just watched something shift in the architecture of another person and is noting the coordinates. What does enough look like? He said. Marsh has the petition in progress. We have Eliza Forrest's statement. We have the timeline of the land purchase. We need the seller's records showing prior contact. She was thinking out loud now, the words coming fast and organized. If I go to Alder Gulch now, not to confront Margaret, not yet just to establish myself, find work, find housing, make contact with people who might know the other side of what Margaret has been building. She'll know you're there. Yes. Within days. Yes. Emily met his eyes. That's acceptable, because knowing I'm there is different from being able to do anything about it. I'm not a body on a trail anymore. I have a name and a record and a witness. She can't erase me with a blanket and a piece of bread this time. Cole was quiet for a long moment. You're going whether I agree or not, he said. I'm going, Emily said. The question is how I go, and whether I go alone. The silence that followed was the specific kind of silence that occurs when a question is asked without being spoken, and both people in the room know exactly what the question is. Cole looked at the fire, then at his hands, then at Emily. I haven't been north in 3 years, he said. I know. Alder Gulch isn't the frontier. It's a town. There are people. There are complications that don't exist out here. I know that too. What I'm trying to tell you, he said, and his voice had something in it she hadn't heard before, something slightly rougher than his usual flat precision, slightly less controlled, is that going into a town means going back into things I left behind in a town. And I'm not sure I'm the same man I was when I left. Emily looked at him steadily. You're not, she said. Neither am I. He met her eyes. Maybe that's enough, she said quietly. He held her gaze for a moment that lasted longer than their previous moments. Then he looked away and stood and went to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the dark. We leave in 4 days, he said. That gives me time to secure the cabin and gives you time to write to Marsh with the new timeline. Emily exhaled. Cole. 4 days, he said again, not cutting her off, just making the thing concrete before it could become something that required more words than either of them was comfortable with. 4 days, she agreed. She sat back down at the workbench and picked up her pen. He stayed at the window. The fire burned steady. Outside, the autumn wind came off the mountains, and for the first time it carried cold in it, real cold, not just the edge of it. Summer was ending. The morning of the second day before their departure, a rider came again. Not the mail carrier this time. This was a different horse, a different pace, harder, faster, the kind of riding that had purpose rather than schedule behind it. Cole heard it from the lean-to and came out with his rifle already in hand. Emily was at the creek and heard it too and came up the bank without being called. The rider pulled up hard. It was a man she didn't recognize, heavy-set, red-faced from riding, wearing a decent coat that didn't match the horse he was on. Not a courier. Not a traitor. The coat was too good for either. He looked at Cole. Then he looked at Emily. His eyes stayed on Emily. "You, Emily Carter," he said. Cole stepped forward. Not aggressively, just forward one step, placing himself in the geometry of the conversation. "Who's asking?" Cole said. The man looked at him with the expression of someone recalibrating. Cole was not a large man in the way that was immediately threatening, but he was a man who held his rifle, the way a person held a tool they used regularly, and this registered. "Name's Burden," the man said. "I work for Gerald Webb, Territorial Land Agent, Madison County." Emily felt something cold go through her chest. She kept her face still. "I've been asked to locate a Miss Emily Carter and deliver a message," Burden said. "By whom?" Emily said. Burden looked at her. He reached into his coat and produced a sealed letter. "By Mrs. Margaret Carter, formerly Hale. She's been informed you're in the area, and she'd like to extend an invitation." He held out the letter. Emily walked forward and took it. She did not open it immediately. She held it in her hand and looked at the seal red wax pressed with a small formal stamp she didn't recognize. Margaret's new seal. Margaret's new name. Margaret's new world. "How did she know where to send you?" Emily said. Burden shifted in his saddle. "I was told to check with the trading routes south of the Madison Valley. Your name came up in Burnt Creek." Marsh, Emily thought. Not Marsh himself. Marsh was careful. But someone in Burnt Creek had talked because someone always talked because frontier towns were small, and a young woman and a mountain cowboy asking questions about territorial law was the kind of thing people remembered and repeated. "You can tell Mrs. Carter that I received her message," Emily said. "She'd like a reply." "She'll get one." Emily looked up at the writer. "In my own time." Burden looked at Cole. Cole looked back at him with exactly nothing on his face. Burden touched his hat and turned his horse and rode south. Emily stood in the yard and looked at the sealed letter. Cole came to stand beside her. "Open it," he said. She broke the seal. The letter was one page written in Margaret's precise, elegant handwriting, the hand of a woman who had been educated and who used that education as a signal. She read it aloud. "Dear Emily, word has reached me that you are alive and well in the Wyoming Territory, and I confess this news gives me relief. The circumstances of our parting were difficult, and I have thought of you often. I understand that grief and shock may have colored your memory of those days as it colored mine. I would welcome the opportunity to speak with you directly, to address any misunderstandings that time and distance may have allowed to grow, and to offer what assistance I am able to provide in helping you establish yourself in a new life. I am hosting a gathering at my property in Alder Gulch on the 15th of October. I would be honored to count you among my guests. Yours in continued goodwill, Margaret." Emily stopped reading. The silence lasted several seconds. "Misunderstandings," Cole said. His voice was very flat. "That's the word she used. She's inviting you to her house. She's inviting me somewhere she controls on her timeline in front of her guests, where she can manage the narrative of what happened between us before I have the chance to establish one of my own." Emily folded the letter with care. "This isn't goodwill. It's positioning. She knows you're building something. She knows I'm trying to. She doesn't know how far along I am." Emily looked at the folded letter. "She wrote this because she thinks she can still manage me. That's important." "Why?" "Because it means she's not certain I can hurt her yet." Emily's jaw set. If she thought I was a genuine threat, she wouldn't invite me to dinner. She'd do something else. Cole was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do?" Emily looked at him. Something had settled in her face that hadn't been there before that letter arrived. Something harder and clearer, and entirely without the grief softness it had carried for months. "I'm going to accept," she said. Cole stared at her. "I'm going to write back and accept her invitation. I'm going to walk into her house in Alder Gulch on the 15th of October, and I'm going to look her in the eye and let her believe she is managing me." Emily's voice was completely steady. "And while she's managing me, Abel Marsh is going to be filing our petition with the circuit court. and Eliza Forrest is going to have her statement notarized. And we are going to use Margaret's own invitation as the reason for our presence in Alder Gulch without raising any flags. Cole looked at her for a long moment. "That's either very smart," he said, "or it's the kind of thing that sounds smart until you're in the room." "I know." She held his gaze. "That's why I need you in the room with me." His expression didn't shift, but something moved behind it, deep and controlled, and not entirely resolved. "A mountain man at a dinner party," he said. "A man who knows how to read a room," she said, "and who looks like exactly the kind of person Margaret Hale would underestimate." He looked away. He looked at the mountains. He looked back at her. "We still leave in 2 days," he said. "Yes. But we don't go straight to Alder Gulch. We go to Burnt Creek first. Marsh needs to know the timeline has changed." "Agreed. And you write your acceptance letter tonight. Clear, polite, give her nothing she can use." "I know how to write to Margaret," Emily said quietly. He nodded once. He turned and walked back toward the cabin. Then he stopped his back to her. "Emily." "Yes." "She invited you because she thinks you're still the girl who stood in the road watching the wagon drive away." He turned his head just enough to be heard clearly. "Make sure she keeps thinking that, right up until she can't." He went inside. Emily stood in the yard, holding Margaret's letter in one hand, and feeling the autumn wind lift her hair and the cold in it that hadn't been there 2 weeks ago. She thought about the wagon driving away. She thought about standing in the road with a blanket over her arm and a piece of bread and $41 that were no longer hers. She thought about the way Margaret had not looked back. She thought about what it meant that Margaret was looking now. Then she went inside and sat at the workbench and wrote 2 letters in the same hour, one to Abel Marsh, clear and precise, outlining the new timeline and the urgency of the petition filing. One to Margaret Hale, warm and carefully non-committal, accepting the invitation with the polished graciousness of a woman who had nothing to hide. When she finished both, she set them side by side on the workbench and looked at them. 2 different voices, 2 different purposes, both true in their way to the person she had become in this cabin on this hillside over the course of one long Wyoming summer. Cole came in from outside, brushed off his jacket, looked at the letters. He didn't read them. He didn't ask about them. "Fire needs wood," he said. Emily stood up, gathered the letters, and went to add them to the oilskin pouch. "I'll get it," she said. She went outside into the cold dusk and came back with an armful of wood and built the fire up the way Cole had taught her, not fast, not extravagant, but steady and calculated, and built to last through the night. He watched her do it from across the room. Neither of them spoke, but the thing between them had changed again, shifted on its center, the way it had shifted before, finding a new configuration that neither of them had quite mapped yet, and both of them had agreed without discussion to leave unnamed for now. The fire took. The light steadied. Outside, the dark of the Wyoming autumn settled over the valley, and in 2 days they would ride out of it and everything they were carrying. The letters and the records and the witness statements and the complicated, unspoken thing that had grown in the space between 2 people who had both been stripped down to their essentials by circumstance. All of it was going north with them. All of it was going to Alder Gulch. They rode out before dawn on the 3rd day. The cabin was secured, shutters latched, stores protected, the snare line cleared and coiled. Cole saddled both horses without discussion and tied their supplies with the practiced efficiency of a man who had broken camp many times and knew exactly what he needed and what he didn't. Emily packed the oilskin pouch last, strapping it inside her coat against her body. The letters, the documentation, Eliza Forrest's statement, everything she had built over the course of a summer that had remade her from the inside out. She stood at the cabin door for a moment before closing it. 3 months ago, she had walked through a different door, the door of a wagon in the dark, onto a Wyoming trail, with nothing but a blanket and a piece of bread. She had been 23 years old and completely alone, and the wolves had been real, and the dark had been absolute. She pulled the cabin door shut. Cole was already on his gray waiting. He did not rush her. He never rushed her. She had noticed he was a man who moved at exactly the speed required, and no faster, and he extended that same precision to the people around him. She mounted the bay. "Ready?" he said. She adjusted the reins. She looked north in the direction they were riding, in the direction of Burnt Creek, and beyond it the trail to the Madison Valley. And beyond that, the town of Alder Gulch, where Margaret Hale was hosting a dinner party and engaging herself to a land agent and building an empire on Robert Carter's money and the silence of everyone who had looked away. "Ready?" Emily said. Cole turned the gray north. She turned the bay and rode beside him, and the trail unfolded ahead of them in the last of the autumn dark, and behind them the cabin on the hillside sat silent and empty, and waiting. The way all places wait that have held something important and know it. The horses moved into a steady rhythm. Emily's breath clouded in the cold air. She sat straight and rode well, better than she had ridden into Burnt Creek 2 months ago, better than she had ridden in Ohio, better than she had ridden anywhere. The land had done that. The summer had done that. The man riding beside her who had handed her a rifle and walked east toward a snare line and told her about a man he'd ridden past 6 years ago and never went back for. He had done that. She would not forget any of it. And, in approximately 3 weeks, neither would Margaret Hale. They reached Burnt Creek on the second evening, and Abel Marsh was waiting for them. Not at his office. At Hargrove's store. Which meant Hargrove had sent word ahead, which meant the network Cole had built over years of quiet provision runs was working in ways Emily hadn't fully understood until now. Marsh was sitting at the back table with 2 cups of coffee already poured when they walked through the door, and he looked at Emily with the expression of a man who had been thinking hard about something and was relieved to have the person he'd been thinking about in front of him. "Sit down," he said. "Both of you." They sat. Emily pulled the oilskin pouch from inside her coat and set it on the table. Marsh looked at it, then at her. "The petition is drafted," he said. "It's ready to file. But I need you to understand what filing it means before I do." "Tell me," Emily said. "Once it's filed with the Circuit Court Registrar, it becomes a matter of public record. Anyone can request to see it, including Gerald Webb, who is the territorial land agent, and who as of this week is not just engaged to Margaret Hale." Marsh paused. "They married 4 days ago." The table went very quiet. Emily heard the words. She placed them in order. She looked at Marsh and said with great precision, "She moved the wedding forward. Apparently, because she knew we were building a case." "That would be my reading, yes." "Which means—" Emily stopped. She put her hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. "Which means she now has direct access to the Land Records Office. Anything we file goes through her husband's desk. Not necessarily his desk personally," Marsh said. "He has clerks. The registrar's office has its own staff. But Webb sets the priorities, and Webb controls which petitions get expedited and which ones sit in a drawer for 8 months while the statute of limitations runs." Cole, who had been still since Marsh spoke, said, "Can we file with a different court?" Marsh looked at him. "The Circuit Court has jurisdiction by territory. If we file outside Madison County, we'd need to argue a change of venue, which requires a judge to agree that the local court is compromised. That's not a short process." "How long?" Emily said. 6 months, maybe more." Emily breathed in, breathed out. She thought about the letter in her pouch. Margaret's letter, the invitation, the polished handwriting, and the red wax seal. She thought about what Cole had said. "She invited you because she thinks you're still the girl who stood in the road." "She married him to close the door," Emily said quietly, "before we could walk through it." "Yes," Marsh said. "That's what she did. Then we go through a different door." Emily looked up. "Marsh, you said 6 months to argue a change of venue. What do we need to prove the local court is compromised?" "Evidence that the presiding land agent has a direct financial or personal interest in the outcome of the case. He's married to the defendant. That's personal interest, yes." Marsh leaned forward slightly. "But here's the problem, Miss Carter. Gerald Webb is not named in your petition. Your case is against Margaret Hale. Now Margaret Webb for estate fraud. Webb himself hasn't done anything legally actionable. Yet. The marriage alone isn't enough to prove the court is compromised. A judge would say that clerks handle filings, not the agent personally, and without evidence that Webb has directly interfered. Then we need to file first, Emily said, before he has a reason to interfere. We file today, we get the petition into the official record before he has specific knowledge of what's in it, and then if he tries to bury it, that action itself becomes evidence of compromise. Marsh looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Cole. Cole said nothing, but his expression said something, the particular expression he wore when he had assessed a situation and found the assessment sound. Marsh reached into his satchel and produced a document, 6 pages dense with formal language. He slid it across the table to Emily. Read it, he said. All of it. Make sure every fact is accurate before you sign. Emily read. She read slowly and carefully, the way she read everything that mattered, not rushing toward the end, but checking every sentence against what she knew to be true. Twice, she stopped and asked Marsh to clarify a point of legal language. Once she asked him to amend a date she was certain was wrong by 2 days. He made the amendment without argument. When she finished, she looked up. The seller's records, she said. The prior correspondence showing Margaret contacted the Alder Gulch seller before she married my father. Did we receive anything? Not yet. I have a letter outstanding. Marsh hesitated. The seller has responded once. He says he'll cooperate. He's locating his correspondence files. We don't have it yet. No. Emily looked at the document. Without the seller's records, the petition argued estate fraud based on the timeline of the land purchase and Eliza Forrest's testimony. It was substantial. It was not complete. Cole said, "File it." She looked at him. "File what you have," he said. "The seller's records come in, you add them. You wait for perfect. You wait until Webb has had 6 weeks as a married man to understand exactly what's at stake and arrange things accordingly." He held her gaze. "File today." Emily looked at the document. She thought about her father's voice reading Psalms at the kitchen table in Ohio. She thought about $41 in a tin box that was no longer hers. She thought about a trail in the Wyoming summer and the sound of a wagon moving away and the decision she had made sitting by a pile of boulders to not be the girl who stayed where she'd been left. She picked up Marsh's pen. She signed. Marsh filed the petition that afternoon with the Burnt Creek postmaster, sealed and addressed to the circuit court registrar in Helena with a request for expedited processing on grounds of time-sensitive property dispute. It would reach Helena in 4 to 6 days by the northern mail route. The registrar's acknowledgement would come back within the week after that. Emily stood outside Marsh's office after it was done and felt something she hadn't expected. Not relief, not triumph. Something quieter. The feeling of a door closing behind her that she could not reopen. She had committed now. The petition existed in the world outside her oilskin pouch. It had a date and a signature and a destination, and Margaret Webb née Hale would know about it within days of it arriving. Cole came to stand beside her. "How do you feel?" "Afraid," she said. He looked at her. "I know that's not what you expected me to say," she said. "It's what I expected," he said. "It's the right thing to feel." She looked at him. He was watching the street with the steady outward attention he used to disguise the fact that he was actually watching her, and she had learned to recognize this, and found it consistently something she did not have a clean word for. "We still have Margaret's dinner," she said. "October 15th. 9 days." He nodded. "I need to find somewhere to stay in Alder Gulch," she said, "before the dinner. I need to be established there, not arriving as a guest, arriving as someone who lives there. It changes how I'm perceived." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Hargrove has a cousin in Alder Gulch, a woman named Pearl Sutton. She runs a boarding house on the east side of town. Respectable. Private." He paused. "I can ask Hargrove to write to her." "Can you do that today?" "Already did," he said. She turned to look at him fully. He was looking at the street. "Before we left the cabin," he said, I sent a letter with the rider who checks this route on Tuesdays. Hargrove confirmed Pearl has a room available when we arrived. Emily stared at him. You arranged this before I even knew we were filing today. I arranged it in case we filed today. His tone was entirely even. You were always going to sign that document. I just needed to know you'd read it first. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to the street. Cole Maddox, she said. Ma'am. You are considerably more complicated than you appear. Something moved in the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The nearest thing to one she had seen on him in 4 months. Ready to ride north, he said. Yes, she said. Let's go. Alder Gulch was larger than Emily had pictured it. She had built an image of it from Marsh's descriptions and Hargrove's reports and the particular imagination of someone who has never seen a place but has thought about it with great intensity. She had expected a mining camp grown larger, rough at the edges, practical in its bones. What she found when they rode in on the afternoon of the second day of travel was a town that had decided to take itself seriously. There were proper storefronts, a bank with a painted sign, a hotel 3 stories high, 2 churches, 1 Methodist, 1 Catholic, a courthouse under construction at the north end of the main street, its fresh timber skeleton visible against the autumn sky, and in the center of it all, on a parcel of land that commanded the main intersection with the precision of a woman who understood exactly what visibility meant, Margaret Webb's property. A house, not a cabin. 2 stories whitewashed with a covered porch and a garden that had been planted with the intention of permanence. Emily looked at it from the saddle for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked away. Cole was watching her. I expected it to be harder to see, she said. It's just a house. What did you think it would be? I don't know. Something that looked more like what it is. Things built on fraud look like everything else, Cole said. That's the point. Pearl Sutton's boarding house was on the east side of town, as described, a solid 2-story building with clean windows, and a woman of about 50 standing on the front porch with the expression of someone who had agreed to something and intended to honor it, but reserved the right to form her own opinions. Pearl Sutton looked at Emily the way she looked at Cole, which was to say directly, without adjustment for gender or appearance, or the dust of the trail. You're the Carter girl, she said to Emily. I am. Hargrove said you were in some kind of legal trouble. I'm resolving it, Emily said. Pearl looked at her for a moment. Then, rooms upstairs, second on the left. Meals are at 6 and noon. I don't allow drinking on the premises, and I don't ask questions about my guest's business unless it starts affecting mine. She glanced at Cole. You staying too? Separate room, Cole said. If you have one. I have one. Pearl looked between them with the practiced neutrality of a woman who had run a boarding house for 15 years and had long since stopped being surprised by the configurations people arrived in. Come in then, both of you. That evening, sitting at Pearl's table with 3 other boarders, a mining surveyor, a young Methodist preacher, and a quiet woman who sewed for the hotel and said nothing during dinner, Emily heard Margaret's name for the first time spoken by strangers. The mining surveyor mentioned it casually in the course of describing a land dispute he'd been asked to survey near the gulch's eastern boundary. Webb's wife has been buying up the creekside parcels faster than the ink dries, he said with the tone of someone who found this mildly interesting rather than troubling. Smart woman. Knows what the water rights are going to be worth when the next mining wave comes. Emily kept her expression entirely neutral. She passed the bread. After dinner, she and Cole sat on the boarding house porch in the autumn cold, and she said, She's been buying water rights. I heard. That's not just land speculation. Water rights in a mining district determine who can operate and who can't. If she controls the water access, she controls the economic life of half this town. Emily looked at her hands. That's not a widow setting herself up comfortably. That's someone building leverage. Over who? Everyone. She looked at him. Including Gerald Webb. A man married to a woman who controls the water rights of his district has a professional interest in keeping her happy. Cole was quiet. The marriage wasn't just about closing our door, Emily said slowly. It was about securing a partner who has institutional power and a personal reason to use it on her behalf. She looked at the dark street. She's been planning this since Ohio. Maybe before Ohio. Cole leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. What do you do with that? I think about it, she said. I think about how much of what she's built here is visible, and how much of it is underneath, and I figure out which parts are vulnerable before I walk into her house in 9 days. He looked sideways at her. You're not walking into that dinner to accept her mercy. No, Emily said. I am walking in to understand the full shape of what she's built, because you can't dismantle something you haven't mapped. The cold settled around them. From somewhere in the middle of town, a piano was playing in a saloon. Something bright and slightly out of tune, the sound carrying in the clear autumn air. Cole, she said. Yeah. When this is over? She stopped. He waited. When this is over, she said again, I don't know what I'm going to want. I don't know where I'm going to want to be. I haven't let myself think about it because thinking about what comes after felt like assuming I was going to get there. He looked at her. I'm letting myself think about it now, she said. That's all I'm saying. He was quiet for a long moment. The piano played. The autumn dark pressed close. All right, he said. It was not a small thing the way he said it. It was not a placeholder or a deflection. It was a man acknowledging that a door had been opened and choosing not to close it. Emily looked at the street. Good night, Cole. Good night, Emily. She went inside. He stayed on the porch a while longer, and she heard his boots on the boards for a few minutes as he moved and resettled, and then stillness. The next 7 days were the most precise work Emily had ever done. Every morning she walked a different part of Alder Gulch. She did not rush. She moved like a woman who was simply learning a new town, which was true, and which also provided cover for the fact that she was mapping everything: who owned what, who talked to whom, which businesses operated on credit and which on cash, which men touched their hats when Margaret Webb passed and which ones looked away. She found the surveyor useful. His name was Nathan Cord, and he was talkative in the way of a man who spent most of his days alone and enjoyed the company of someone who asked intelligent questions. She bought him coffee twice at the hotel dining room and listened to him describe the creekside parcels Margaret had purchased and the water rights attached to them. On the 4th day, Nathan said something that stopped her cold. Funny thing about the Delacroix parcel, he said, wrapping both hands around his cup. Webb filed the transfer paperwork himself. Personal. Not through a clerk. Emily set her cup down. Is that unusual? For the land agent to personally file a transfer for his wife's parcel? Nathan considered. Not illegal, but unusual. He's got 4 clerks whose entire job is handling that paperwork. A man that busy doing his own wife's filing means either he's a very devoted husband or he wanted to make sure something specific was in the official record. Emily said, or something specific was not in the official record. Nathan looked at her. He was not a stupid man. He had simply not previously had a reason to think about this particular filing in this particular way. I'd have to look at the original transfer document, he said carefully. Could you? It's a public record, he said. Anyone can request a copy from the registrar's office. He paused. The registrar reports to Webb. I know, Emily said. But the request itself is also a public record. If a copy of that document is requested by a named individual on a named date, that request exists in the record, regardless of whether the copy is produced. Nathan looked at her for a long moment. Miss Carter, he said slowly, what exactly are you planning? Emily met his eyes. I'm planning to walk into a dinner party on the 15th and have a conversation with a woman who believes I'm manageable. Everything I'm doing before that is making sure that if she tries anything after that dinner, there's already a public record of what she's been building here. Nathan was quiet for a moment. I'll request the Delacroix transfer document this afternoon, he said, in my name, for professional survey purposes, which is entirely legitimate since the parcel abuts a property I've been hired to survey. Emily picked up her coffee cup. Thank you, Nathan. He touched his hat. A woman who does her homework before she walks into a fight, he said. I respect that. She smiled and said nothing else and finished her coffee and walked back to Pearl Sutton's boarding house with another piece of the picture in place. She found Cole on the boarding house porch when she returned, sitting with his hat on his knee, and a particular quality of stillness that she had learned to read as something being wrong. She sat down beside him. What happened? He looked at her. Margaret Webb came to call this morning. Emily's breath stopped for exactly 1 second. Here, she said. Here, at this boarding house. While you were out. His voice was very flat and very controlled. She spoke to Pearl. She introduced herself as a neighbor welcoming a new resident of the town. She asked after you by name. She knows I'm staying here. She knew before you arrived. My name or your name in Hargrove's correspondence, something leaked. Cole's jaw was tight. She's been watching the boarding houses since the petition was filed. She knew we'd come here eventually. Emily looked at the street. The implications arranged themselves with terrible clarity. She knows about the petition, Emily said. She has to. Webb is the land agent. The registrar's acknowledgement would have crossed his desk. Cole looked at her. Which means she's known for days. She invited you to that dinner, knowing full well you'd filed a legal claim against her. She came here to do what? Emily said. To warn me. To look at you, Cole said. Pearl said she was very pleasant, very warm. She left a note. He produced it from his coat pocket. Emily took it. The note was 4 lines. Margaret's handwriting, the same precise, elegant hand. Emily, I understand you are newly arrived in Alder Gulch. I do hope the town suits you. I also hope you will reconsider the petition you have filed with the circuit court, as I believe it is based on a misunderstanding of your father's final wishes that I would be most happy to clarify. My door is always open. Margaret. Emily read it twice. Then she folded it and held it in her lap. Final wishes, she said. Cole looked at her. She's claiming my father expressed final wishes that support her position. Emily's voice was very quiet. She has something. A document. A letter. Something she's going to produce that she says represents my father's intentions. Cole was very still. Could she have? My father was sick for months before he died. He was weak. He trusted her. Emily looked at her hands. I don't know what she might have gotten him to sign. I don't know what she told him he was signing. She looked up. Or what she manufactured after he was gone. The silence stretched out. This was the thing she had been afraid of without knowing she was afraid of it. Not the legal process, not the land agent husband, not the water rights, or the community standing. This the possibility that Margaret had prepared for even this contingency, that somewhere in a file in that whitewashed house at the main intersection, there was a piece of paper with Robert Carter's signature on it that would undo everything Emily had built. Cole said, "What do you need?" She thought. Fast and hard. Marsh, she said. I need to write to Marsh tonight. If Margaret intends to produce a document in response to our petition, she's required to file it with the court before the hearing. If it's a will or a written instruction of any kind, it has to be authenticated. She was thinking out loud, working through it. The doctor in Ohio. He knew my father at the end. He knew what condition he was in mentally, not just physically. A man who is suffering from the kind of illness my father had in the final weeks in the heat of a Wyoming summer. His capacity to make legally binding decisions could be questioned. You'd be questioning your father's mental state. I'd be questioning whether Margaret gave him something to sign in circumstances where he was capable of understanding what he was signing. Her voice steadied. Those are different things. Cole looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the controlled steadiness on her face and the grief running underneath it that she was not allowing to surface right now, because right now was not the time. I'll ride for Burnt Creek in the morning, he said. Marsh can send an urgent wire to the Ohio doctor directly from the telegraph office there, faster than a letter. Emily looked at him. You'd ride back to Burnt Creek. 2 days there, 2 days back. You have the dinner on the 15th. I'd be back before then. You don't have to. I know, he said. I'm going. She held his gaze. There was nothing manageable about what she was feeling in that moment. The gratitude and the fear and the grief for her father, and the specific, complicated weight of being known by another person, of being seen clearly by someone who had no obligation to keep looking and kept looking anyway. Cole, she said. I'll leave before sunrise, he said. You'll be fine here. Pearl is... Cole. Her voice stopped him. Thank you. For all of it. Not just this. All of it. He was quiet. He turned his hat in his hands once the small motion he made when words were required, and he was deciding which ones. Your father raised somebody worth coming back for, he said finally. I figured I owed it to him to make sure she got where she was going. Emily pressed her lips together. He stood up. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a long day for both of us. He went inside. Emily sat on the porch alone in the autumn cold, with Margaret's note in her lap, and the petition in a courthouse in Helena, and her father buried in an unmarked grave beside an unnamed creek in Wyoming, and she did not cry. She was past crying for now, past it in the specific way. You get past something by walking through it. So many times it no longer requires your tears, but she sat with all of it, the whole weight of the summer, and what it had cost her, and what it had built in her, until the cold got too deep to ignore. Then she went inside. Then she wrote to Abel Marsh by candlelight 5 pages. Everything she knew, and everything she suspected, and everything she needed, before the 15th of October. Then she slept. 4 days until Margaret's dinner party. 4 days to finish mapping the shape of what she was walking into. 4 days. And then Emily Carter was going to walk through Margaret Webb's front door and let the woman who had left her on a trail to die believe for one last careful evening that she was still manageable. And every word, every document, every stone she had laid in the foundation over the course of one long Wyoming summer was going to hold. She had made sure of it. She was going to make sure of it again. Cole rode back into Alder Gulch on the morning of the 14th with mud on his boots and a telegram in his coat pocket. Emily heard his horse before she saw him. She had developed that habit without noticing the way you develop all the habits that matter gradually and then completely. She was on Pearl's porch with her 5th cup of coffee, and her documentation spread across her knees when the gray came around the east corner of the main street, and she stood before she'd consciously decided to stand. He dismounted, tied the horse, came up the porch steps, and handed her the telegram without preamble. She read it. It was from Dr. Harold Fenwick, her father's physician in Chillicothe, Ohio. Marsh had reached him by wire 2 days prior. The response was 3 paragraphs of careful medical language that distilled to 3 essential facts. Robert Carter had been diagnosed with advanced pulmonary consumption in February. Margaret Hale had been present at that appointment. She had asked specific questions about the timeline of the illness and the expected deterioration of her father's cognitive function in the final stages. And in the doctor's professional opinion, by the time the wagon train departed Ohio in May, Robert Carter's capacity to make complex legal decisions would have been significantly compromised by both the illness and the laudanum he had been prescribed for pain management. Emily read it twice. Then she held it against her chest for a moment with her eyes closed. She was at the diagnosis appointment, she said. She knew exactly what she was getting and how long she had to work with, Cole said. He sat down on the porch step and looked at his hands. He had ridden hard, and it showed the particular worn quality of a man who has pushed past comfort into necessity. She married him 6 weeks after that appointment. Emily opened her eyes. The laudanum. She controlled his medication on the trail. Marsh said the same thing when I read him the wire. If she managed his doses, increased them in the final weeks, she could have gotten him to sign anything, and he would have had no clear memory of it afterward. Emily's voice was level and precise and completely without room for the grief that was running underneath it. That's not just fraud. That's... I know what it is, Cole said quietly. She looked at him. He was looking at the street, his jaw set in the way it got when he was holding something in that needed holding. Marsh filed an amended petition this morning, Cole said. He was waiting for the wire before he sent it. The amended version includes the medical evidence and adds a formal allegation of undue influence over a cognitively impaired individual. He paused. He also contacted the federal land office in Helena directly. Not the circuit court, the federal office. Emily stared at him. Why federal? Because undue influence and fraudulent property transfer, involving a federal land grant, which the Alder Gulch parcel partially is, falls under federal jurisdiction. Webb's authority doesn't extend to the federal land office. Cole looked at her. A federal investigator has been dispatched from Helena. He arrives in Alder Gulch in approximately 4 days. The silence on that porch lasted 5 full seconds. 4 days, Emily said. 4 days. That's after the dinner. Yes. Emily sat back down. She set the telegram carefully on top of her documentation. She looked at the main street at the whitewashed house at the intersection that she had been looking at every day for a week, mapping its angles, counting its visitors, noting who went in and who came out, and what expression they wore when they left. She doesn't know about the federal investigator, Emily said. Not yet. Marsh moved fast and quietly, but Webb will hear something. Men in his position always hear something within a day or two, maybe sooner. Which means tonight's dinner may be the last conversation I have with Margaret before everything changes. Emily looked at Cole. She'll still think she controls the situation. She has her document, whatever she got my father to sign. She thinks that's enough to answer our petition and close the matter. She doesn't know what we added to the petition this morning, Cole said. No. Emily picked up her coffee cup and then set it back down. Cole, at that dinner tonight, I need you there. I'll be there. Not outside. Inside, at the table. He looked at her. I need a witness, she said. Whatever Margaret says to me tonight, whatever she reveals, whatever she threatens or offers or implies, I need someone who heard it. Someone whose word means something. She met his eyes steadily. Yours means something. He was quiet for a moment. She'll know who I am. She'll know you're the man I've been staying near in Wyoming. She won't know what you know or what you've helped build. Emily kept her eyes on his. Let her underestimate you. You're good at that. Something crossed his face, the shadow of wry recognition. A mountain cowboy at a dinner party, he said. A witness at a reckoning, she said. He held her gaze. Then he stood up and said, I need 2 hours to clean up and rest the horse. You have 3, she said. Dinner is at 7. He went inside. Emily sat on the porch and looked at the telegram and thought about her father in a doctor's office in Ohio with Margaret sitting beside him asking precise questions about the timeline of his dying. She thought about how carefully Margaret had listened, how carefully she had planned. She thought about how her father had looked at Margaret and seen warmth. She thought he deserved better than what he got. And then, with the particular resolve that had been building in her since July, she thought, so did I, and I am going to do something about it. Margaret Webb's house was everything it looked like from the outside, deliberate, controlled, furnished with the taste of someone who understood that objects communicated status and had chosen every object accordingly. Emily registered all of it in the first 30 seconds and filed it away and concentrated on the room's people. There were 8 guests. 2 couples she didn't know, mining investors from Virginia City, well-dressed, comfortable in their money. A Methodist minister and his wife. Nathan Cord, the surveyor who met Emily's eyes when she entered and gave a fractional nod. And Gerald Webb. Emily had not seen Gerald Webb before. He was 50. Broad-faced with the specific confidence of a man who had held institutional power long enough to have stopped distinguishing between the authority of his office and the authority of his person. He looked at Emily the way a man looks at a variable he has been told about and is now assessing in person. She looked back at him with the pleasant, open expression she had been practicing for a week. Margaret was at the center of the room. She was 52 and beautiful in the way that certain women are beautiful, not softly, not accidentally, but with the precision of someone who has understood since girlhood that appearance is a resource and has managed it accordingly. She wore dark green silk. Her hair was perfect. Her expression when she saw Emily was warm. Emily. She crossed the room and took both of Emily's hands and looked at her with what appeared to be genuine relief. You look wonderful. This climate suits you. It does, Emily said. Thank you for the invitation, Margaret. Of course. Margaret's hands were cool and dry and held Emily's for exactly the right amount of time. Then she looked at Cole standing slightly behind Emily's right shoulder. And this is, Margaret said. Cole Maddox, Emily said. A friend. Margaret looked at Cole with the precise social assessment of a woman who had been reading rooms for decades. She saw a lean man in clean clothes, hat in hand, dark eyes giving her nothing, posture relaxed but not loose. She made a decision about him in 3 seconds. Emily could see the decision he registered as peripheral. Accompanying. Not significant. Mr. Maddox. Margaret smiled. Welcome. Cole tipped his head. Ma'am? That was all. That was exactly right. Margaret drew Emily into the room with the smooth social navigation of a woman entirely in her element, introducing her to the Virginia City couples, exchanging pleasantries, guiding the conversation with the practiced ease of a hostess who had learned that if you control the conversation's surface, you control its depth. Emily matched her. She had been raised by a schoolteacher who believed that language was precision, and she had spent the last 4 months developing a different kind of precision entirely, and she sat at that dinner table and was warm and pleasant and attentive and gave Margaret absolutely nothing to work with. Across the table, Cole sat between the minister's wife and Nathan Cord and said very little and watched everything. Gerald Webb at the head of the table was quiet for the first half of dinner. He ate. He listened. He looked at Emily twice with the expression of a man performing a reassessment. It was during the soup course that Margaret made her first move. She did it gracefully, a pivot in the table conversation so smooth that only Emily and possibly Cole recognized it for what it was. I've been meaning to speak with you about your father, Margaret said, addressing Emily directly, but in the tone of table conversation, so that the whole room could hear while appearing not to. I know the last months were difficult for both of us. Robert's illness changed him, I think you know that. By the end, his thoughts were sometimes unclear. Emily set her spoon down. I remember him very clearly. Of course you do. Margaret's voice was all warmth and careful sorrow. But there were things he expressed to me, wishes toward the end about how his estate should be handled, that I don't think he had the opportunity to share with you directly. The illness moved so quickly. What kinds of wishes? Emily said. The table had gone subtly quieter. Not silent, the mining investors' wives were still murmuring to each other, but the particular social quiet of people listening without appearing to listen. Margaret reached into the small bag at her chair and produced a folded document. She set it on the table with the deliberateness of someone placing a card they are confident will end the hand. Your father wrote this in June, she said, 3 weeks before he passed. He asked me to witness it and keep it safe. It expresses his intention that his estate, including all liquid assets, be transferred to my management to ensure, as he put it, that I would be provided for. Margaret slid the document toward Emily. He was concerned, Emily, about leaving me without security. Emily did not move to take the document. Who else witnessed it? She said. The wagon master. Thomas. Thomas, Emily repeated. Who was under contract to you for the duration of the journey? The warmth in Margaret's expression held, but something shifted behind it, very slightly. Thomas was a respected man on that trail, Margaret said. He was, Emily agreed. He was also a man whose contract payment depended on the goodwill of the wagon party's primary financier. She looked at the document on the table. I'd like to know the date on that document. June 12th. My father was on laudanum by the 1st of June, Emily said. Not loudly, not with heat. In the same pleasant conversational register she'd been using all evening. For pain management. Dr. Harold Fenwick of Chillicothe, Ohio, prescribed it at his May appointment. The one you attended, Margaret. Silence. Real silence this time. The minister's wife had stopped her murmuring. Gerald Webb had set down his fork. Margaret looked at Emily. The warmth was still on her face. Underneath it, something recalibrated. "I was at that appointment to support my husband," Margaret said. "You were at that appointment to understand the timeline," Emily said. "You asked the doctor specific questions about cognitive deterioration in the final stages of pulmonary consumption." Dr. Fenwick remembers the appointment clearly. He provided a written statement to that effect 2 days ago. Margaret did not look away. She was too disciplined for that. "Emily," she said, and her voice had shifted, still controlled but lower, more private, the voice of a conversation she had intended to have later in the evening in a smaller room. "I think perhaps we should discuss this." "I'm happy to discuss it here," Emily said. "These are your guests, Margaret. You invited me into this room. I'm simply having a conversation." Gerald Webb said, "Miss Carter." His voice had authority in it, the instinctive authority of a man accustomed to having it. "I'm not sure this is the appropriate venue. Mr. Webb." Emily looked at him directly. "A federal investigator from the land office in Helena arrives in Alder Gulch in 4 days. He's been dispatched to review the circumstances of the Delacroix parcel, transfer the one you filed personally, rather than through your clerks." She held his gaze. "I'm not sure any venue in this town is going to feel appropriate to you in the next few weeks. But I'd rather we be honest about that now than pretend over soup." Webb stared at her. Nathan Cord, between Cole and the minister's wife, was looking at his plate with the focused neutrality of a man who knew exactly what was happening and had decided which side of it he was on. Cole was watching Margaret. Margaret was looking at Emily. And in that look, in that specific held, uncovered look, Emily saw something she had not expected to see. Not fear, not rage, not the cold calculation she had learned to expect from Margaret's face. She saw recognition, the look of a woman who had underestimated another woman and was now in the space of a dinner party correcting that assessment in real time. "You've been busy," Margaret said quietly. "Yes," Emily said. "I have." "Since Wyoming." "Since Wyoming." Margaret was quiet for a moment. The table around them had gone entirely still. The mining investors had stopped pretending not to listen. The minister's wife had her hands folded in her lap. Then Margaret picked up the document from the table and folded it and put it back in her bag. It was such a small gesture, so contained. But Emily understood exactly what it meant. Margaret was not going to produce that document in this room. Not now. Not with a federal investigator 4 days out and a table full of witnesses who had just heard everything that had been said. The document would go to her lawyers. It would be examined. It would be argued over in correspondence for months. But it would never again be a card played with confidence. "Shall we have dessert?" Margaret said to the table at large. Her voice was entirely steady. Her posture was entirely correct. She was, Emily thought, genuinely remarkable. Even now. The dinner resumed. The surface of the evening reconstituted itself, and the Virginia City couples picked up their murmuring, and the minister said something about the new church construction, and the soup was cleared, and the dessert was brought. But the room had changed. Everyone in it knew it. Margaret knew it most of all. Emily and Cole left at 9 o'clock. Margaret walked them to the door herself. Of course she did. She was a hostess until the last moment of the last moment, and she shook Emily's hand at the threshold with the same composed warmth she had used when they arrived. But she held Emily's hand a half-second longer than necessary, and she said very quietly so that only Emily could hear, "You are your father's daughter." Emily looked at her. "Yes," she said. "I am." She walked down the porch steps and into the autumn night with Cole 2 steps to her right, and she did not look back at the house, and she did not speak until they had turned the corner onto the side street, and the sounds of the dinner party were behind them. Then she stopped walking. Cole stopped beside her. She stood in the dark of the Alder Gulch side street, with her hands at her sides, and breathed the careful, deliberate breathing she had been practicing since July, the breathing that held large things inside a steady container. "She's going to fight the petition," Emily said. "Yes. The document, whatever my father signs, she'll produce it through her lawyers. We'll argue undue influence. It could take months." "Probably will. Webb is going to be investigated by the Federal Land Office. That's going to complicate everything she's built here. The water rights, the land purchases, all of it is going to be scrutinized." "Yes." "And she knew," Emily said. "When I walked out of that room, she knew that none of what she built is as secure as it was this morning." She looked at Cole. "I didn't destroy it tonight. I just made sure she knows it can be destroyed." "That's enough for tonight," he said. She looked at him in the dark. He was watching her with the steady attention she had grown accustomed to, the attention that didn't ask anything of her, didn't require her to be any particular way, just noted where she was and stayed present to it. "She said I was my father's daughter," Emily said. "You are." She meant it as a... Emily stopped. "I don't know what she meant it as. A warning, maybe. An acknowledgement." She looked at her hands. He would have hated all of this. He was not a man for confrontation. He was a man for books and Sunday morning psalms and laughing at his own jokes. Her voice was steady. "He would have wanted me to find a quiet life and be happy in it." "And," Cole said. "And I am going to do exactly that," Emily said. "After." She looked at him. "Cole." Her voice shifted, not softer exactly, but different. The particular quality it had on the nights in the cabin when the fire burned low and the walls between them got thin. "I meant what I said on the porch. About letting myself think about what comes after." He was very still. "I don't know what I want yet," she said. "Not specifically, but I know it involves..." She paused, and the pause was not uncertainty. It was care. The care of a person choosing words that mean exactly what they say. "I know it involves not being far from where you are." He looked at her for a long moment. The autumn dark was absolute around them. Somewhere down the main street, a horse stamped and settled. "That cabin's going to need a new roof before winter," he said. His voice was very even. "I know," she said. "I helped you stack the timber for it in August. You did a poor job on the east side." "I had never stacked roofing timber before." "No," he said. "You hadn't." He looked at her. Something in his face had changed the long-held tension of a man who had been deciding something for months and had finally decided it. "You're better at it now." Emily looked at him and felt for the first time since her father's death something she did not have to analyze or manage or protect. Something that simply was. "Yes," she said. "I am." He held out his hand. She took it. They stood there in the dark of Alder Gulch for a moment, not moving, not speaking, just present to the thing that had grown between them over the course of one long Wyoming summer. The thing built from snare lines and rifle practice and fire building and grief and stubbornness. And two people who had both been stripped down to their essentials and had found in that stripping something they recognized in each other. Then he turned, and she walked beside him, and they went back to Pearl Sutton's boarding house through the cold autumn night. The federal investigator arrived on the 19th. His name was Calloway, and he was a quiet man of 40, with the organized thoroughness of someone whose entire professional value resided in his ability to find what people had tried to hide. He spent 3 days in the records office, 4 hours with Nathan Cord, and 2 hours with Emily in Pearl Sutton's front parlor, during which Emily placed her complete documentation, every letter, every date, every notation she had made since that night, beside a pile of Wyoming boulders in front of him, and walked him through it with the precision of a woman who had been building toward this moment since July. Calloway asked careful questions. He took careful notes. He said nothing that could be interpreted as a conclusion. When he left the parlor, he said, "Miss Carter, this is a thorough record." "I had time to be thorough," she said. He nodded and put on his hat and walked out. Cole was in the doorway. He looked at Emily. "Well," he said. "He didn't say anything useful." "What did his face say?" Emily thought about it. That he was not surprised by anything he read. Cole considered this. "That's useful." She looked at him. "I know." The circuit court hearing was scheduled for January. Abel Marsh came to Alder Gulch in November to prepare, and he sat with Emily for 3 days, going through every document, every date, every potential argument Margaret's lawyers would make, and every response. He was thorough and unglamorous and completely reliable, and Emily was more grateful for him than she could efficiently express. On the second evening, Marsh looked at her across Pearl's parlor table and said, "You know there's no guarantee." "I know." "Margaret's lawyers are experienced. The document your father signed, even with the undue influence argument, even with the medical evidence, a judge could decide the evidence is insufficient. Courts are unpredictable." "I know that too," Emily said. "And if you lose, I won't be worse off than I was in July," Emily said. "I was in July with a blanket and a piece of bread and wolves 3 feet away. Everything since then has been forward movement." She met Marsh's eyes. "I'm not doing this because I'm guaranteed to win. I'm doing this because not doing it would mean accepting that what happened to my father and to me was acceptable. And it wasn't." Marsh was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've written a lot of petitions in my career, Miss Carter, for minors and settlers and widows and men who got cheated out of claims by people more powerful than them." He folded his hands on the table. "I don't usually have an opinion about outcomes. This time I do." Emily looked at him. "I think you deserve to win," he said, "and I think you're going to." The hearing was on a Thursday in January in a courtroom in Helena that smelled of pine resin and cold air and the particular formality of a space where consequences were decided. Margaret was there with 2 lawyers and Gerald Webb, who had been quietly suspended from his position pending the federal investigation, and who sat with the specific stillness of a man conserving energy for something he could not yet name. Emily sat with Marsh and a territorial attorney Marsh had brought from Bozeman, a woman named Clara Hayes, which was a thing Emily registered and held privately. Cole sat in the gallery 3rd row, hat on his knee. The judge was 65, sharp-eyed, from Virginia, originally with the compressed efficiency of a man who had heard enough excuses in his career to have stopped being impressed by them. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Margaret's lawyers produced the document. Emily's team produced Dr. Fenwick's statement. Margaret's lawyers argued the signature was given freely. Emily's team produced the medical record of laudanum dosage in the final weeks of the journey obtained through Calloway's federal investigation. Margaret's lawyers called Thomas, the wagon master, who testified that Robert Carter had seemed clear-minded when he signed. Clara Hayes asked Thomas one question on cross-examination. "Mr. Thomas, was your contract payment for the wagon journey contingent on completing the journey successfully under Mrs. Hale's direction?" Thomas said yes. Hayes sat down. The judge called a recess. He came back 40 minutes later. He spoke for 11 minutes. Emily heard the words move through the room, the way water moves through terrain, finding the low places filling them. Undue influence. Compromised capacity. Fraudulent intent, evidenced by prior contact with the seller of the Alder Gulch property. The document produced by the defendant was found to have been executed under conditions that did not meet the legal standard for testamentary capacity. The petition was granted. The estate assets, the liquid funds Robert Carter had carried, were to be calculated and returned. The land transfers executed using those funds were to be reviewed by the Federal Land Office. Margaret Webb was liable for the full sum. Emily sat very still through all of it. When the judge finished and the room began to move, Marsh put his pen down and said, "Emily." She looked at him. "You won," he said. She looked at the front of the room where Margaret's lawyers were speaking to her in low, urgent voices, and Margaret was listening with her eyes forward and her posture correct and her expression giving nothing away. Even now, even here, Margaret gave nothing away. Emily felt something complex move through her. Not triumph exactly, not the clean, bright feeling she had sometimes imagined this moment carrying. Something more layered. The grief for her father, which had never left and would not leave. The long wait of the summer and what it had required of her. The quiet knowledge that what had been done to Robert Carter could not be undone by any court, that justice and restoration were not the same thing, that she had won something real and important, and it did not bring him back. She held all of it. Then she stood up and gathered her papers and walked out of the courtroom into the January cold. Cole was on the courthouse steps. He looked at her face and said nothing. She stopped beside him. The Helena Street was busy in the winter noon horses and wagons, and the sound of a town that did not particularly care what had just happened inside one of its buildings. "It's over," she said. He looked at her. "How do you feel?" She thought about it honestly. "Like I kept a promise to someone who needed me to keep it." She looked at him. "Like I can stop running the case through my head at 3 in the morning and start thinking about something else." "Like what?" She looked at him. The winter light was flat and clear and very honest, and she stood in it and let herself be seen. "Like a cabin in Wyoming that needs a new roof," she said. "And a valley I know better than I know anywhere else. And a man who handed me a rifle and walked east and let me figure out the rest." Cole held her gaze. "The east side of that roof is still going to need work," he said. "Then we'd better start before the snow gets worse," she said. He held out his hand. She took it. And Emily Carter, who had been left on a trail in the summer dust, with nothing but a blanket and a borrowed Mercy, who had learned to set snares and shoot straight and build fires that lasted through the night, who had documented a fraud and filed a petition and walked into a dinner party as a lamb and walked out having shown her teeth. Emily. Carter looked at the mountains visible at the end of the Helena Street and felt for the first time in a very long time that the direction she was facing was not away from something. It was toward something. And this time she was the one who chose it.